everybody. It's Stephanie Baker, the Executive Director for Life in Abundance, and we're doing another episode of On the Couch today. Just kind of want to remind everybody of why we're doing this series, and that is to offer you information on various counseling topics. So we will be talking to different counselors. Some of those counselors are part of the Life in Abundance team. Some of them are not. But I think the topics that we're going to address, you will find helpful. I know there are a lot of people that don't really have any information on some of these, and maybe they have friends that go to counseling and they're hearing things, but they haven't ever been to a counselor themselves because they're, well, maybe afraid to do that. And so we want to approach some of those topics and make them more real, more tangible, and give information that you might very well find helpful. We're also going to be talking to functional nutrition and functional medical professionals, because we believe that we are body, soul, and spirit beings. And so when one of those areas is tweaked, the other two are as well. So we look at people here in this practice as whole human beings. And if somebody has, for example, a physical ailment, it certainly is going to impact how their emotions are in many cases. Sometimes even things as simple as a vitamin D level may be low, and that person might feel like they're experiencing some depression or extreme fatigue. And so we look at all things I do in my practice when it comes to working with clients. The other thing that we're going to be doing is highlighting local ministries that have resources that you may never have heard about, that are doing great things within the community. And so today I want to welcome somebody. I'm super proud of her. She's a member of our team here at Life in Abundance. Her name is Meredith Yoder, and Meredith is a clinical pastoral counselor on our team. She has her Master of Arts in Biblical Counseling from Baptist Theological Seminary. She is also a clinical pastoral counselor through the National Christian Counselors Association. And so, Meredith, we are super excited that you are here today with us for the On the Couch episode. We're also really excited and interested in the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And so Meredith and I want to talk about the concept of forgiveness. I know, Meredith, in a lot of my sessions, forgiveness is a topic that comes up quite often. Or let me rephrase it, unforgiveness is a topic that comes up quite frequently. And I know you and I have talked, and I know that that's also pretty common in your practice as well. And so I was hoping maybe you could shed some light for our listeners on that topic and sort of where you start with somebody who has been offended. They could be the victim of a crime. They could be the victim of dysfunction by somebody else in their family. It spans, many things. Let's start off with defining what forgiveness really is about. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you. I'm happy to be here. I think really the way that we can best define forgiveness is by saying what it is not. And forgiveness is not easy. It is not simple. It's not condoning the sin. It's not automatic. It's a process. This is
Mhm,
not something that you can just decide in a day and boom, you're good.
mhm.
It's not forgetting the offense. It's not even trusting the offender again. You
Right.
can forgive someone and have a different relationship going forward. It
Absolutely.
is, yes, it is, in the same breath, it's not, forgiving is not with an absence of consequences. You can forgive and there still be consequences in place. Forgiving is not enabling the sinner. And it is not, most importantly, it is not a feeling. It is an act of the will.
Yes. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with this book or not, but it was written by Dr. Dick Tibbetts, and it's called Forgive to Live. And it's very helpful. I use it with my clients, and he states a lot of the same things that I've just heard you talk about. But he says that forgiveness is two facets. The first is, as you said, decisional. There's the decisional piece. I choose to forgive. I am willing, and I talk about it with my clients. It means you're willing to be willing for Jesus to do the work. I don't believe that you or I on our own are able to forgive. I don't believe that. It has to be a work of the Holy Spirit through us to be able to do that. So that's the decision. And I know that in my own life, there have been some things where I was like, I'm not, I can't forgive this. This is, I'm nowhere near that. And so I phrase it this way to my clients: as soon as I step back and go, Jesus, I choose you over the offense, because I can't hold on to both. I can't hold on to Jesus and the offense at the same time. So I have to be willing, my chooser in me has to be willing to allow God to do what he needs to do, realizing and submitting, because I know I can't do it. And then the second part is the emotional part of forgiveness, which I heard you talk about. And it takes time for emotions to catch up with a decision. And I think that's the part that people think, oh well, I've decided, so everything just has to go back to normal. No, no, it doesn't. And I loved that you said that forgiveness is not trust. No, it isn't. It is not the same thing as trust. And I think that's very confusing for people. I mean,
Mhm.
you could steal, you could work for me and steal money from me. I can forgive you, but that doesn't mean I'm going to give you the keys to the cash box again, right?
Right,
And
right.
I think that's what you're talking about. And many times for safety, we can forgive someone, but it's not safe emotionally or physically for us to be in a continued close proximity with that person. So more thoughts on that.
Yes. So, well, and as you're saying, forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood topics, I think, in our culture today, for sure.
I
It
agree.
is, and that tends to keep us from being able to feel like we're actually succeeding in our forgiveness.
Mhm.
So there are two things that need to happen when we forgive. To keep it very basic, we need to hold someone accountable. There needs to be one person that is held accountable for for the actions, for the sin, and for the offense. And then the other aspect is that we need to forgive that person. And so forgiveness can happen in one of two ways. There is a relational forgiveness. And with relational forgiveness, the goal of that is reconciliation. There are two parties. And with that, the offender holds the key. So it is conditional upon the offender doing several things. The first is that person needs to confess, they need to acknowledge their part in this. They need to own their the sin that they caused you, the hurt, the harm. It needs to be open, it needs to be public, it needs to be complete. They need to take ownership of fault. They need to acknowledge their part in this. Once that is done and there's confession, there needs to be repentance. That repentance needs to be demonstrative. It needs to be observable, measurable, even. There needs to be remorse. There needs to be an attempt at reparation, restitution. How can I make this better? How can I alleviate the harm I have caused?
Mhm.
It needs to bear fruit. So you need to be able to see, okay, this person has owned the offense, and this person also is changing. They have decided to move away from the behavior that has harmed me, and I am seeing them move in a different direction. So that when those two things happen, that produces reconciliation. And again, reconciliation does not mean you become best friends again. You
Right.
can, but it doesn't have to be that. It can mean we are reconciled and in a new, more healthier relationship.
Right. And sometimes that means there's distance. You don't go back to the intensity that there was before. And
Absolutely.
I don't know how you feel about this, but I also believe that God will show us things in relationships that are unhealthy. He will call those things to our attention, and it's up to us as to whether or not we enter back into the same, right? But I love you talking about the actions of the offending party, if we want to use that terminology, to know that there's a sincere ownership of, hey, I did this and I'm really sorry, and then a visible change in behavior. I That's important. But so what happens? Not to cut off the other topics that we want to talk about, but so what happens with the repeated hurt and wounding, the person who refuses to acknowledge that they have ownership in the offense? What do we do
Right.
then?
When we have a situation where the offending party is refusing to acknowledge or take ownership, like you said, then if we don't have that, we can feel like, well, there's no hope for me. I'm
Mhm,
never going to get the justice I need and
mhm,
I deserve. And we believe in a God who is just. We
mhm,
believe in a God who takes sin seriously.
mhm,
And we as image bearers also take sin seriously. And when we are hurt, when we are harmed or sinned against, we want justice, right? And so um, the goal here is, okay, what do I do with all of this? I
mhm,
need to have justice served, and this person is not acknowledging what they've done.
mhm,
So the goal then is to go toward personal forgiveness.
mhm,
And this is you and the Lord, and you alone are doing the work. And so the goal of personal forgiveness is release. The goal here is that I'm freeing myself of this. So in this instance, with personal forgiveness, the person who has been harmed holds the key. We are not relying, it's not conditional upon the offender. So with personal forgiveness, Brene Brown, she lists 6 steps
mhm,
that Byron Kaler mentions in his course of forgiveness. And that starts with number 1, naming the injury. We need to know what that cost was. We need to know, what did this involve?
mhm,
How long did this last? What has this cost me?
mhm,
You need to fully take the time to comprehend what exactly it is that you are releasing, what exactly it is that you are forgiving. How deep did this go? And then, secondly, you need to claim that injury. You need to stop rationalizing it away. You need to own it. I accept the damages. I know that this has happened. And now I am going to not let it define me. This has happened. I own it. I understand how it happened. And now we're going to claim it. And then the third step is that you blame the injurer. So, in order to forgive someone, you've got to blame someone. Now, Byron Kaler says that this is a great place to visit, but it's a horrible place to live. And I think that's huge because we can so easily get caught up in focusing on who is to blame in this situation. And that's not healthy. So, we need to know, we need to visit this, know who is to blame, but then keep moving. Then, after that, we want to reestablish power. At this point in the process, I fully understand what has been done to me. I own it. I'm aware of it. I know who is to blame. And I now am going to seek to gain strength from this. How can I grow from this? How can I move forward better? What are the things that I need to do to gain strength from this? And then after that, and only then, do we then choose to forgive? So it's a whole process. This is not just a one day I decided to forgive and I'm going to say 3 words and boom, everything's going to be better.
mhm,
It's a whole process of fully understanding the weight of the sin and the weight of the offense. So
mhm,
when you choose to forgive, you're saying, I that person no longer owes me anything. I am turning my accounts over to God, and He is going to handle the collection of that sin,
mhm,
and He is going to get justice. I'm
mhm,
not worrying about this anymore. I am not letting this take over my life anymore.
mhm,
The Lord is handling this on my behalf. You release the injurer, you start moving on. Um, you become responsible for your present and your future.
mhm,
And then after that, the last step is that birth of new self. You move forward in freedom and change, using this to change for the better.
mhm. You know, Lisa Turkhurst, if I'm not mistaken, it was one of her Bible studies, talked a lot about forgiveness. And one of the exercises, and I might have this slightly wrong, but hopefully I'll hit the majority of it correctly. She was working with her counselor and basically was listing all of the things that were costs. I call them losses. with my clients, and I actually will have them identify what are the losses, because I believe that really in forgiveness, there's a grief process. You're grieving the losses of something, right? Even if it's the loss of safety, if it's a loss of trust, all of the above. Like, what did you lose? Because I can't, to your point, release unless I name that. Otherwise, I'm just going to stay in that place of stunted grief. Um, but with her counselor, so she listed everything, and her counselor had her and do it on index cards and laid them all across the floor, and then put pieces of red felt over each one of them, stating the blood of Jesus covers this, regardless of what the other person does or does not do. I think I'm somewhere close in that, but I thought that was such a powerful exercise, with that,
Yes.
and it was a visual. I find also that even writing the losses, a lot of people respond very well to visual work. And so whenever we can write things out, it makes it a little bit more tangible for us. But I also love the fact that we can go to the Lord and hand him our account, the ledger that we feel is owed to us by the other person. And God has not missed one thing, no matter what has gone on, as awful as the offense may be. God has not missed anything. And so I can, in all faith, lay those things before him. I may not understand why things were allowed, but what I can be assured of is that God is in the midst of the healing that is about to happen when I take that step to be willing. I just keep coming back to the willingness. If I'm not willing, nothing is going to change for me. And it's that setting you free is what we're really talking about. And yes, we've all heard, okay, it's forgiveness is not about you, it's about the other, or it's not about the other person, it's about you. That is true, but why? Why is because I can't control another human being. Who I can control is me, my thoughts, my actions, right? And so forgiveness does not have to be dependent on another person, which I think you've outlined, very, very well here. And in many cases, the other person isn't even half the time aware that they've offended you. Um, I hear that a lot. I heard something even today, as a matter of fact, in a session about that. So, what else would you say? What would you say to somebody who said, "I can't forgive this. There's no way." The person who lost a loved one to a drunk driving accident. What do you say to that person who's sitting on your couch?
I think in those times, because I think we've all experienced that where we feel like it's too it's too deep, it's too grave. I cannot forgive this. But when we are, and I think that those are the times when we are full of emotion as well.
Mhm,
With,
mhm,
like you said, there's grief here, there's a lot of emotion here, there's
mhm,
hurt and pain. But in
mhm.
those times, I think it is when we have to remind ourselves that we ourselves have been forgiven,
Yes.
that there is nothing that I am not capable of. And the Lord knows my sin, and the Lord has forgiven me of my sin. Who am
Mhm.
I to withhold forgiveness for someone else?
It's interesting. I love that you went that direction. First thing, God above all knows what it's like to have something unjustly done to a family member, right? I mean, the death of Jesus, he willingly gave up his life, but that doesn't change the surrounding facts as to why he had to, or what brought it to that point. He didn't have to; he willingly did it. But the other thing, too, is when we are thinking about forgiveness, one of the exercises that I have given, the wives of some clients that are dealing with pornography addiction with their spouses. They've found out that their spouse has a pornography addiction, and they're kind of stuck in the "how can I forgive this" phase. I actually have them when they start feeling triggered by something. One of the things I have them do is recount their own week and where they see sin in their own life. Because and this may be a controversial statement, but the playing field really is level when it comes to sin. It's we want to highlight certain sins, but lying is no worse than stealing. I mean, we want to make things worse. We want to use our judicial system
Right.
in our minds. I'm not even talking about the legal system, but we want to justify or give the weight of each sin, and that's not ours to do. God has identified them and says He will make all things right in His time and in His judgment. But I think it does us good to remember that my sin is just different. We're not proud of whatever it is, but it's just different. It's sin. And I know there are different, there are different perspectives on sin. And so where I land with those clients is the the time you feel like you're taking the moral high ground with your sin is that's the very time you're going to stop your progress in moving through forgiveness.
Right. Absolutely.
Mhm.
And I think that it's important moving forward. I mean, you can go through this whole process, right? And this can take weeks, months, years
Mhm.
of just really working through this. And then once you get to a place where, okay, I think I'm done with this. I'm ready to forgive. I'm ready to release this. I'm ready to hand this over. I've done the work to comprehend what's happened. I think once moving forward, we can get into a place where then we become surprised when we get slapped in the face with a trigger, when we have an emotion rise up.
Mhm. Mhm.
And again, have to go back to this is not an act of emotion, this is an act of the will. And I think it is important that we are intentional about taking every thought captive, relying, going back to Philippians 4:8, and saying, hey, okay, I'm struggling today. Are these thoughts right? Are they pure? Are they honorable? Are they just? Are they
Mhm.
lovely or commendable? Is this from my father or is this from my enemy? What's happening? We have to take our thoughts captive. We have to assess what we're thinking. If we don't do that, we risk falling back into old patterns of belief and habits,
Mhm.
and we will find ourselves back into the grips of unforgiveness. This is an act of the will. We have to work on this. It's not going to be a one time thing and done. We have to stay on guard.
Mhm. Yes, because the enemy likes nothing more. He knows what the trigger points are for us. He can't read our thoughts, but he can sure put them in our minds, right? And I think a lot of times we just partner with him. Like, as soon as that thought hits, see, nothing's ever going to change. I was stupid to think about forgiving this person. Look, they're not changing, so on and so forth. But what I hear you saying is what I refer to as a choice to either walk in the flesh or walk in the spirit. When I'm walking in the spirit, I'm not going to spin out in my emotions. Now, it's not to say that I didn't get triggered and I'm not feeling an emotion, but I'm going to work around, I'm going to circumvent acting out of my emotions by going into the truth, which is what you're talking about. I'm going to question, okay, what am I feeling? What's really causing this? Which is actually whatever it is I'm telling myself about the event, right? What the meaning is or how I've defined the event. And so once I do that, I'm already moving out of my emotional brain into my logical and thinking brain. And that's where truth resides. We know truth to be God if you're a believer, right? And so I think it's a way of centering ourselves and not spinning out in the flesh, because if I'm acting in my flesh, scripture tells us for the wages of sin is death, right? And so flesh is always going to lead to sin. There's no other place it leads. So flesh leads to sin, which leads to death. Well, does it mean that I'm going to die on the spot? No. But what it does mean is that it's going to try to kill every bit of the fruit of the spirit in me: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self control, right? All of those. And so if I choose to walk in the Spirit and I'm focusing on that, I'm not focusing on the offense. I'm focusing on the presence of God in that moment. I'm focusing on the truth in His Word, and then He's doing the other transformation work in me at that moment. This is hard. This is not just simple. If it were, everybody'd do it and there'd be no issue. But it is work. And one of the things that I think also is that we go through this, it's a chance to grow closer to God in the midst of it. It's a chance for us to reflect His heart, not our own. Um, Thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. It does bring us closer to the Father, and it allows us to experience the pain he experienced when he was sinned against.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows us to fully comprehend the weight of his forgiving us.
Hmm.
Well, as much as we can, as human
Right,
beings.
right.
But I 1,000% agree with you. This done with intentionality and with the help of the Holy Spirit will lead to a freedom that I think everyone longs for. And I
Yes.
believe it's worth it. The work that you have to put into this is worth it.
It is, for anybody who has submitted themselves. I keep coming back to that when we talk about the act of will. The act of will is submission. It's our submission. In that moment of, I need you to pay for what you've done, we're thinking about the other person's submission, but the kingdom perspective would be our submission to God to allow Him to do the work in us. Um, as I've told clients many times over the years when they sit down on my couch, we can talk about various people in your life, but ultimately, what you're here to talk about has everything to do with you and Jesus. Like that's
Right.
right, that connection. And I think too, you may have touched on this, but there's a strong connection to how we witnessed forgiveness in our families. Like what was the attitude surrounding that? How was it modeled for us? We tend to repeat things that we were taught, things that we learned in childhood, whether they were healthy or unhealthy, healthy or dysfunctional. So this may be new for somebody um, who's listening. This may feel like, well, if I forgive this person, what you guys are telling me is that it just doesn't matter what happens to them, or because of what they did. It's not about that. It's not about that. We do have a judicial system, a legal system that deals with crime. And that is, in a lot of cases, that's part of what goes on in an offense if we're talking about a crime. But with everything else, with family members, with friends, colleagues, coworkers, um, it's us choosing to be to be willing to let God do the work, and it's just not dependent on what they do or not, as far as
That's right.
as far as our transformation.
Yes.
So
It's
it's that act of
trusting.
submission.
Yes. It's trusting that God is fully capable of of taking and receiving the justice that is owed. We
Yes.
no longer need to seek what is owed to us. God is going to handle that. And He will handle it in a way that we can't even comprehend, fathom, or do.
Right. And one of the
And
things I've heard another counselor on our team talk about is us placing ourselves in the judgment seat of Christ. And that's never what was meant to happen. We are not the judge.
right,
That's not to say that we don't speak truth in situations, but we're not the judge. And so, as far as that goes, that's the job of Jesus. And so that submission that we're talking about, in that willing to let God do His work in us, that submission keeps us off of that judgment seat.
right. And
Mhm.
if we are the judge, then that puts us in a place where we are having to control everything.
Yes,
That
yes.
is consuming.
Mhm.
That is distracting.
It's
That is like
exhausting.
poison. It's exhausting. We can't handle that. We are not meant to be able to do that.
That's
So
right.
that is putting on our shoulders something that God never intended for us to carry.
Yeah.
That is a burden that is far too heavy for us. I personally would rather walk in freedom.
Me too. Me too. And the reason that we can say that is because there have been experiences. We've had experiential encounters with God to experience that freedom, that peace that surpasses all understanding. I have felt that, and it's different than anything that I could ever manufacture. It defies this world when you experience it. And so what would you tell somebody who is considering counseling because of unforgiveness, and they're angry, they're bitter, and they're considering counseling, but they're afraid to do it? What would you say to that person?
I would say it's worth it. I would say those first few steps are going to be the most scary. But I think
Mhm.
once you get into this process and you start the naming process and you start realizing all of the weight it's carried and the process itself, I think there's healing in that. And
Mhm.
so I think it's worth it. I think it's worth taking those first few terrifying steps into this where you're thinking, you might be questioning, is this really helpful? Is this really worth
Mhm.
it? It feels better if we're focusing on our emotions. It feels better to hold it and to hold that grudge and to be angry. It feels like mistakenly,
Control.
yeah, it feels like you are exuding justice on that person when really all you're doing is hurting yourself, you know. And I do think that that is something that is more popular in culture to believe that yes, holding unforgiveness only hurts me.
Mhm.
But then what do you do with that? So I do think that this process that Byron Kaler puts, he has a wonderful course online on forgiveness that I highly recommend. That if anyone wants to go more into detail on the forgiveness, biblical forgiveness, I would recommend that they go and look up that course. But it is so worth it. And I know it's scary, and I know releasing control is never at the beginning something that feels good,
Right.
but God is he is worthy, he is a good father, he's kind, and he cares about sin and he cares about injustice.
Yes, he does. I think also somebody that's thinking about counseling, especially biblical counseling, may be thinking, well, I'm not going to walk into an office and just have somebody tell me that it just didn't matter what happened, because it did matter. And yes, maybe I need to forgive, but I want to talk about what happened and the fact that it did matter and it is a loss. And so I would tell that person, we absolutely need to talk about what the loss is for you. But the goal is not to leave you there. The
Right.
goal is to move, and you've said it a couple of times, is to move forward. And what would it look like for you if you were able to move forward? What would change in your life? What would you see that would tell you that you were moving forward? Those
Exactly.
types of things. So,
Yes. Yes. Keeping in mind that the goal is release,
yes,
and and having your goals in mind of how do I grow in strength? What do I gain from releasing this? How can I come out of this better? How can I no longer allow this to define me?
right, right. I think too, something that you were talking about, us needing justice. We want justice. That is ingrained. I mean, we could look at also birth order and firstborns. I'm one of those.
Mhm.
Have a laser sharp sense of justice. That's one of our traits, right? But going back to that from your conversation, we just want to make it clear that that's a natural tendency. Um, And so we're not saying that you're going to, like, we are going to lead you to want to seek justice. It's not that. What we're saying is that is part, we're identifying that as part of the process of forgiveness, is acknowledging that you have that build in you.
Right.
You know. So, well,
Exactly.
this has been awesome information. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. And I know you've actually got clients coming in right after this. So thank you so much, Meredith. It was a pleasure, and we're going to have you back, and we'll talk about some other counseling topics too when we can get our schedules coordinated. Thanks a ton.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure.